Maintaining homeostasis is a requirement for staying alive. Homeostasis, the definition is a state of steady internal conditions maintained by living things. So think about when you go to a doctor's office. The first thing they do is they take your temperature, they take your blood pressure, they measure your weight, and they record all of that. And what they're looking for when they're measuring and recording all of that is whether you are in the normal range for those parameters. So um, with things that are kept in homeostasis in the body, there is a set point, which is a physiological value around which the normal range fluctuates. So a great example of this is the human body temperature, which averages 37 degrees Celsius, which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, body temperature isn't always right at that temperature. It might be a little bit above that or a little bit below that, but as long as it's within a small range around the set point, then you're still okay. So you're not going to die if your body temperature goes up to 100 degrees, but if it goes up to 110 degrees, then you are going to die. So the normal homeostatic range is the acceptable physiological values. If your values are within that range, you are considered healthy. If they are outside of that range, then it could mean that you have a disease or disorder. And if it gets too far out of that range, it could mean that you are dead or going to die very soon. So think also, anytime you've gone to the doctor's office, if they take blood, and if you ever looked at the lab report that comes back from the blood sample, it usually shows a lower acceptable level and like an upper acceptable level. And as long as your numbers are within that higher and lower numbers, then you're okay. But if your values are above the higher number or below the lower number, then it could mean that there is something wrong with your body and it's not working the way that it should. Now, your body thankfully has a lot of different ways that it helps to maintain homeostasis. And the main way that it maintains homeostasis is through feedback systems. And the primary one is negative feedback, but we'll talk about positive feedback as well. So negative feedback is more common. And one key thing I want to point out is that the word negative here does not mean bad. Negative just means the opposite of what was originally happening. So in negative feedback, if something increases, the body is going to do something to decrease it. If something decreases, the body is going to do something to do the opposite or increase it. So for example, when your body temperature goes up, your body starts sweating in order to cool you down. When your body temperature gets too cold, your body starts shivering in order to warm you back up. It's not just body temperature, but think about blood pressure. If your blood pressure gets too high, your body does things to try to decrease your blood pressure. If your blood pressure gets too low, your body does things to try to increase your blood pressure. We'll talk a little bit more about negative feedback on a future slide, but just to do a quick introduction of positive feedback. Positive feedback is less common than negative feedback, but it's still very important for maintaining homeostasis. And in this case, remember that negative doesn't mean bad, and positive doesn't necessarily mean good. Not saying that positive feedback is a bad thing, but it's not that positive feedback is better than negative feedback. They're both good and very important. In positive feedback, whatever happens, whatever stimulus kind of starts happening in the body then does something to kind of encourage that stimulus to move in the same direction. So we'll talk about that more in a couple of slides. But before we talk about those in more detail, we have to talk about how our body knows what is going on in our body and how our body is able to respond. So there are three main structures involved in these feedback systems. The first one is a receptor, which is the sensor. So the sensor is the thing that is detecting that something is changing. So you might have a thermoreceptor that's detecting that your body is getting too hot. Or you might have a pressure receptor that's detecting that your blood pressure is getting too high. The sensor or the receptor then sends the information through the nervous system to the control center, which is usually the brain, but sometimes it's also the spinal cord. The control center is where the current value is compared to the set point, and then the brain or spinal cord decides how to respond to what the receptor or the sensor detected in order to keep us in homeostasis. So once again, if the sensor detects that our body temperature is getting too hot, the brain determines whether the heat is getting so high that we need to start sweating or not. So the control center, or the brain, then sends information to things called effectors through the nervous system as well. So effectors are the things that respond to either encourage or oppose the original stimulus. So sticking with thermoregulation or maintaining normal body temperature, the sensor would be a thermoreceptor, which would detect that we're getting too hot. And then the brain would send a signal to the sweat glands, and the sweat glands would be the effectors. And these sweat glands would release sweat in order to cool us back down and bring us back into a homeostatic range. So in negative feedback, the original stimulus, so in this case, an increase in heat, is going to push whatever in this case, the body temperature away from the set point. The sensor detects that change, sends that information to the control center. The control center then sends information to an effector in order to negate or reverse or oppose the original stimulus. So once again, if the stimulus detects that we're too hot, the control center is going to stimulate an effector to cool us down. Negative feedback is ongoing. It started before you were born, and it will keep going until you die. Actually, if negative feedback stops happening, that's basically when you die. So it has a stabilizing effect. It's always going to try to keep your body around that set point, or at least within the homeostatic range. And it's, like I said, it's just ongoing. So coming back to this negative feedback example, the thermoregulation or maintenance of homeostatic body temperature, the thermoreceptors detect excess heat, sends those signals to the brain through the nervous system. The brain then analyzes that information and sends a signal to the sweat glands. The sweat glands produce heat, and when that sweat evaporates, that heat leaves the body, and the body temperature returns to the set point. So we can also look on the flip side of that. So what happens when you are too cold? When you're too cold, we can go back to these same structures here, but this will be the opposite. So thermoreceptors will detect that it's too cold and send that signal to the brain. The brain then sends signals to your skeletal muscles, causing them to contract. Those contracting skeletal muscles are what make you shiver, and when muscles contract, they produce heat as a byproduct, and so that heat will help to warm us back up to maintain our normal body temperature. So think about some other examples of negative feedback. So think about all the things that happen when you go to a doctor's office. So what does the doctor measure? We mentioned before things like body temperature and weight and blood pressure, but this can also include things like how fast your heart is beating and levels of things like sodium and potassium in your blood and levels of nutrients like glucose and lipids in your blood. It can be a measure of things like hormones in your blood as well. So all of those things are kept in homeostatic ranges due to negative feedback mechanisms. Now, as we mentioned, positive feedback is not better or worse than negative feedback. Positive just means that whatever the original stimulus is, the body does something that kind of exasperates is what I was trying to say, or increases what that original stimulus did. So in positive feedback, the sensor or the receptor will detect that something has changed. And once again, it sends that information to the control center, which is the brain or spinal cord. The control center is then going to send out information through the nervous system to an effector to amplify or increase whatever the original change or stimulus was. Now, the key thing with positive feedback is it's much rarer than negative feedback. So it's not necessarily always occurring. So whereas negative feedback is stabilizing and ongoing, positive feedback tends to have a set starting point and an ending point. We can also call it the snowball effect because something starts small and then it gets bigger. One of the best examples of positive feedback is childbirth. So we can all acknowledge that childbirth is not something that is happening all the time. Some people, especially the male population, never goes through childbirth, and a large percentage of women don't go through childbirth either. So it's something that has a very specific starting point and ending point to it. So childbirth is primarily controlled by a hormone called oxytocin. And what happens is that oxytocin causes the uterus to contract. And when the uterus contracts, it pushes the baby towards a structure called the cervix. And the cervix is a structure that separates the birth canal or the vagina from the uterus. Now, the cervix has pressure receptors. So as the uterus is pushing the baby towards the cervix detects that pressure and sends a signal to the brain. The brain then sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which is the gland that secretes oxytocin. So as long as the baby is still in there and pushing on the cervix, the pituitary gland is going to secrete more oxytocin. That oxytocin then triggers the uterus to contract again, this time a little bit harder. With that contraction, the baby pushes on the cervix, and the cervix still detects that pressure and sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which then secretes more oxytocin. And this happens continuously. It goes on and on and on until the process ends, which occurs when the baby is born. So there's the starting point in which childbirth starts to occur, and then the set ending point is when the baby is born. And between the beginning and the end, the contractions become closer together and stronger in order to get that baby out of the mother's body. Some other great examples of positive feedback include things like lactation, which is the production of breast milk. So as a baby grows, that baby is going to be eating more, and so the more suckling there is, the more the mother's body will produce more milk. Also, if a mother chooses not to breastfeed, then her body will stop producing milk because it doesn't need it. So lactation has a starting point when the breast starts to produce milk, and it's going to produce more and more milk until the baby is weaned and it no longer gets the suckling stimulus to produce milk. Another great example is blood clotting. So when a blood vessel is damaged and blood is starting to leak out of the area where it should be, small cellular fragments in the blood called platelets start to stick to the damaged blood vessel wall. And the number of platelets that stick increases until the hole is patched, at least temporarily, to form a blood clot. And there are chemical signals involved in this, just like oxytocin is a chemical signal for childbirth. There are chemical signals that help to increase the number of platelets that are sticking to the damaged blood vessel.